Okay, good day. Welcome back to the next video in our series on corresponding squares. This is going to be the last of the more introductory style videos on this topic, which is considering a new or sort of a different type of position which arises, where the key squares are disconnected from one another and there's a very clear minimum length path between the key squares, which is very important for both white and black. So we're going to cover another position by the world champion of pawn endgames, Grigoriev. This is a study from 1921, and once again, I am using Carsten Muller as our guide. In fact, it's actually on the same page from his book, Fundamental Chess Endings. So let's bring up the analysis board. Close the text for a bit. So here's the position. It's a blocked position, or the one the white pawns can move. White pawns on c2 and d3, and a black pawn on c3. Typically, the kings are given in that position where black is kind of blocking the white king to key squares on the king side, and there are key squares on the queen side as well. So I'm just going to use my normal program here. Remember, the first step is what are the key squares? So coded this up. I've improved a little bit. I've decided that I'll use the SVG package, which I've done a very brief video on how to play around with svg.py in Python chess and come up with nice charts. And you can see the key squares highlighted there. There's a couple of redundant ones, obviously the ones on c4 and d4. If you're there, you're winning already. And the one on g4 is not real, because I'm sort of forcing black to be in front of white to work out the key squares. And of course, if you're on g4, then it'll be very, very bad for white if the black king was actually on a square like d2. So the key squares which we are worried about are a3, b3, e2, and f2. So we just close that. And just to clarify that, so what we'll do is let's mark those up. Just move my normal thing. I'll just move the kings out of the way so I can mark things up a bit more clearly. So those key squares are there and there. Now, it's I think you can satisfy yourself that those are key squares, because if on the queen side, mainly because of the white pawn blocking that square, that white will be able to either go that way or shoulder the black king away. And remember, the black king can't go too far away from the pawn, which could well start advancing. Okay, so that's on the queen side. And on the king side, same situation. Because the white pawn is covering that square, once again, the white king is able to shoulder and maneuver around the king side and force the black king back. And then once again, when the situation arrives, we'll just push the pawn and in all likelihood take the black pawn on c3. So that's the key squares. So now the normal process of creating the corresponding squares based on black having to cover the key squares when white is threatening to move on to them. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up the screen grab I had up earlier, and we'll just have a look. I think it's worth going through the text here, because once again, it's a good explanation of the whole general concept of corresponding squares. This is pretty much the first example in this section that Carsten Muller gives. So, and you can see some green highlighting, so that means actually I did read this book back in the day. So we'll just quickly go through the text from the top. And there's that thing. The theory is mainly applicable to block positions. King maneuvers, therefore the main role. And it's all about zugzwang and reciprocal zugzwang. Now this next sentence, which I've highlighted. White moves to a particular square, then black has to move to the corresponding square in order to draw. Okay, that makes sense. White should seek to move to squares in such a way that the black king is unable to keep moving to the corresponding squares, either because it is already there or because it can't fly. So I think we've covered this sort of concept of tricking up black, basically, right? Can't move between corresponding squares which are not contiguous, and also when you hop on the corresponding square of black and there's black to move, they have to move off the corresponding square, and that's where the problem is. And then also this thing about you've got to be aware of pawn moves, which change the corresponding squares, and then counterattacks by black king. I mentioned that earlier, that g4 is pointless because black may just pick up the pawn and actually win the game, right? So you can see on the diagram there, I've actually used little green dots when I did my highlighting many years ago. If you go to that next section I've highlighted, if the key squares are not connected, we should identify the shortest route between them. For white, to get from b3 to e2, that's the closest two squares, it's four squares, and a2, b1, c1, d1, and black has to defend via b4, c5, d4, e3. As both sides have exactly one shortest route, the squares along the way correspond to each other. Because you understand there, if white started running one way, black's got to start running the other way and be on exactly the matching square. If black went too far one way, then white would run back and duck back the other way. So let's just do exactly what he said. He's numbered these 1 to 4. So let's mark them up now. We've got F1, F2, F3, F4 joining the corresponding squares, and on the black side we've got F1, F2, F3, F4 covering those corresponding squares there. Now there's a few spare squares which we're going to have a look at and see if it's often the spare squares which allows white to triangulate. So next we investigate the squares near the key squares. E1 gets a 5, so let's stick a 5 on that. Right, so where would black have to be? Black would have to cover from square 5. He'll have to cover 4 and both of the bit problem with arrows today. Sorry about that. Anyway, you'll have to cover 4 and both key squares, right? So we're going to say there is that there's only one square that does that, and that is the square F3. So that's the corresponding square to square number 5. Now, moving on, we can see Custom then makes a comment about F1. And F1 is maybe not good because he's pointing out that, however, if F1 gets no number because after King E3, King F1 would even lose to King D2, right? So we're not going there. Now, the other potential corresponding square trick is going to be over here on the A1 square. And you can see from the A1 square, white can go to corresponding square number 1 or 2, and luckily black has a square which does that for him, and that is the B5 square. So there's no sort of tricks in the position, and so that means there's no tricks in the position and triangulation possibilities, and the position can be drawn if black is able to move on to the corresponding square in the given starting position. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is move back to the starting position, which is there given by Muller. Now, you'll notice on the diagram, he has plus for white to move. White would just take key square and would win. And then he has equal for black to move. A bit slow, but that's fine. So now it's black to move, and we know the drawing move here. You just go on to the same corresponding square, and that's the line which Muller gives. King F3 exclam. That means that's the only drawing move. Now white can try different things. Let's say white runs across as Muller's described here. King D1. Got to move to E3. King C1 corresponding square 3. We've got to follow. King B1 must follow. King A1, that's being tricky, King A1. So now we've got to go to B5, which seems to have lost its marking. So let me put it back on. And then we now go to A2, which is corresponding square number 1, and we cover with King B4. And then now, okay, so we're not on a key square, but let's say white plays d4 to try and mess things up. Well, I think the best thing to do is just to go and grab that pawn. Yep. d5, take it. King b3. So I guess black is likely to lose his pawn. gets shouldered off. But the point here is that, as we know, when black gets the opposition and the pawn is that far back, then the position is a draw. Right, so I hope that sort of shows from the perspective of when you've got the path, that if white runs from one end of the path to the other, black will do exactly the same thing. Now, just to close up, okay, so there is the Venn diagram layout of this corresponding square position. Notice I've changed the 6 into a 2 and the other numbers are bumped up by 1 so that this diagram worked better, because I wanted the A1, A2 and B1 squares to be rendered together. And what I'd like to show here is that everything's covered. All the corresponding squares are covered. And these little jumps, which are the other transitions which white can make, but you can see every transition white can make is equally, there's a transition black can make. And that's the ideal position where it's matched 1 for 1, so that if black can be on the corresponding square, he'll be able to always stay there. But correspondingly, if black cannot make it onto the corresponding square, then white can win the game. And I've also added this extra thing where I've joined up the key squares to show where the entry points are. And you can see this demonstrates, particularly in this case, which is good, the well-separated entry points of A2 and also which goes to A3 and B3, and D1 and E1, which both go to E2 and F2. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that video looking at corresponding squares, but in this case where there were two groups of key squares which weren't connected, and you had to pay a lot of attention to the minimum path between both of those sets of key squares. Okay, thank you very much for watching.